Welcome back, criminophiles, to another episode of Homicide Cases. I'm your host, Misfit.
I'm Roberto Arguelles, better known as the Salt Lake City Strangler. I'm an American serial killer convicted of 4 homicides and assault.
The Salt Lake City Strangler, a comprehensive forensic and legal analysis.
The criminal history of Roberto Arguelles, historically identified by the media as the Salt Lake City Strangler, represents one of the most significant failures of the juvenile and adult correctional systems in the state of Utah. Spanning from the late 1970s until his death in 2003, Arguelles' trajectory from a delinquent teenager to a lethal serial predator highlights critical vulnerabilities in psychiatric evaluation, parole oversight, and the legal complexities of capital punishment voluntarism. The case is characterized by a repetitive pattern of predatory sexual violence, institutional inability to provide effective intervention for unmotivated offenders, and a final self-inflicted medical crisis that bypassed the state's intended judicial resolution.
The developmental issues and the geography of early predation.
Roberto Arguelles was born on February 14, 1962 in Cairns, Utah. The socio-environmental factors of his upbringing, though limited in the public record, emphasized a childhood marked by intensive labor and geographical isolation. His stepfather moved the family to a pig farm in Salt Lake City during Arguelles' formative years, a location that would later serve as a recurring anchor point for both his early violent impulses and his terminal criminal acts. Forensic analysis suggests that the isolation of the pig farm and the physical nature of the work performed there likely contributed to a worldview centered on dominance and the commodification of physical strength. The onset of Arguelles' documented criminality occurred at age 15, manifesting initially as property crime before rapidly escalating into interpersonal violence. In September 1977, he was apprehended for the attempted theft of a motor vehicle, a common getaway offense for antisocial personalities. However, the rehabilitative promise of probation proved ineffective. By June 1978, Arguelles was remanded to a youth shelter following a domestic battery involving his girlfriend, brother, and mother, an incident demonstrating early evidence of generalized hostility towards family and female figures alike. His subsequent escape from the shelter and the eventual decision by authorities to return him home, despite his volatility, reflect an early systemic tendency towards leniency that would characterize his interactions with the juvenile court for several years.
The 1978 to 1979 escalation. From delinquency to sexual sadism.
The transition from impulsive violence to predatory sexual behavior occurred in October 1978, when the 16-year-old Arguelles kidnapped and assaulted a 10-year-old girl. The juvenile's court response, placing him under house arrest, failed to acknowledge the predatory nature of the crime. Consequently, he remained a present threat to the community, leading to a November 1978 charge for the assault of a 7-year-old girl, though this charge was eventually dismissed. Definitive evidence of Arguelles' escalating lethality emerged in February 1979 when he assaulted a 17-year-old girl. This conviction led to his internment at the State Youth Development Center in Ogden, with a recommendation that he remain detained until the age of 21. It was during this period that the first major psychiatric divergence occurred. Staff at the development center, recognizing their inability to treat juvenile sex offenders, attempted to transfer him to the Utah State Hospital. The hospital's rejection of Arguelles on the grounds that he was unmotivated for treatment remains a focal point of criminological critique. This diagnostic label effectively precluded him from receiving the very interventions that might have identified the depth of his paraphilic disorder. On March 3, 1980, Arguelles kidnapped a 15-year-old student from Granger High School, transporting her to a remote shooting range to commit acts of sodomy and assault. The use of a shooting range as a crime scene indicates a psychological fascination with power and lethality. Only 3 days later, on March 6, 1980, he targeted a 14-year-old girl on her way to Westlake Junior High. He drove her to a dirt road near his stepfather's farm, a location that provided him with a perceived sense of security and environmental control. During the second 1980 attack, the victim's resistance provoked a near-fatal response. Arguelles slashed her throat with the knife. This shift from assault to attempted homicide marked a critical evolution in his offending pattern. The victim survived and provided a comprehensive description of Arguelles and his vehicle, leading to his arrest and subsequent guilty plea in an adult court to charges of attempted homicide, aggravated abuse. Despite the severity of these crimes and repeated warnings from the parole board regarding his danger to the public, Arguelles was eventually paroled on June 25, 1991. The parole of Roberto Arguelles in mid-1991 preceded a 2-month period of lethal violence in early 1992. Operating primarily in West Valley City, Arguelles transitioned from opportunistic assault to premeditated serial homicide. The victims of this period varied in age, but his methodology consistently involved abduction followed by extreme physical violence.
Victims of the 1992 spree.
The homicide of Margot Bond, a janitor at Kennedy Junior High School, demonstrated Arguelles' willingness to target adult women in addition to children. Her body was discovered 4 months after her disappearance in Tualatin County, indicating that Arguelles had begun to expand his geographic disposal radius. However, the March 30th, 1992 abductions of Lisa Martinez and Tuesday Roberts brought his focus back to his childhood home. He intercepted the two teenagers as they walked toward the Valley Fair Mall. In his subsequent confessions, Arguelles detailed the highly frenzied attack of Martinez, using a wood chisel to inflict 43 stab wounds, while Roberts was strangled with a rope, a manual method of killing that requires significant physical proximity and time, reinforcing the Strangler moniker.
Apprehension and investigative breakthroughs.
The arrest of Roberto Arguelles on August 8, 1992, was not initially linked to the homicides of Bond, Blundell, Martinez, or Roberts. Instead, he was apprehended following 2 separate attempts to abduct children using elaborate ruses. On August 1, 1992, he posed as a security guard at Orchard Elementary School, attempting to lure a 10-year-old girl and her 8-year-old brother into his car under the guise of searching for stolen goods. A week later, he utilized a counterfeit police badge in an attempt to kidnap 2 10-year-old girls in front of Hunter High School. Following his conviction for these attempted abductions, Arguelles was sentenced to life imprisonment. While in prison, his behavior remained erratic. He began bragging to cellmates about the 1992 homicides and attempted to extort ransom from the victims' families, demonstrating a continued commitment to psychological torment. These boasts eventually led to formal interviews with investigators in 1996, during which Arguelles confessed to all four homicides and directed authorities to the gravesites located near his stepfather's pig farm.
State v. Arguelles, Legal Precedents and the Capital Trial.
The legal proceedings following Arguelles' confessions were among the most complex in Utah's history, primarily due to the defendant's active pursuit of the death penalty. His case, State v. Arguelles, addressed fundamental questions regarding the right to self-representation and the competency required to waive constitutional appeals.
Procedural hurdles and conflicts of interest.
The defense was initially hampered by a conflict of interest involving the Salt Lake Legal Defenders Association. The magistrate disqualified the LDA because an attorney, Robert Steele, had been present during Arguelles' confessions, and an investigator, Virgil Johnson, had previously investigated Arguelles for other crimes and was expected to testify as a witness for the prosecution regarding aggravating circumstances. Arguelles eventually moved to dismiss his court-appointed standby counsel to represent himself, a motion the court granted after a comprehensive discussion. Throughout the proceedings, Arguelles maintained that he was of sound and discerning mind, and explicitly stated that he felt the death penalty was the appropriate punishment for his crimes. He pled guilty to 4 counts of aggravated homicide and waived his rights to a jury trial for the penalty phase, choosing instead to be sentenced by the court.
The penalty phase and mitigation strategy.
During the penalty phase, the prosecution presented extensive evidence of Arguelles' prior offenses and the testimony of his victims' families. In contrast, Arguelles presented a highly limited mitigation case, relying largely on the testimony of a corrections investigator, Jenny Glover, who spoke to his cooperation in locating the victims' bodies. Medical reports were also introduced describing the history of blackouts, memory loss, and dissociative disorders, although Arguelles largely downplayed these factors in his quest for a death sentence. On June 19, 1997, the trial court sentenced Arguelles to death.
Psychological instability and clinical collapse.
The post-sentencing period of Arguelles' life was marked by extreme psychological deterioration, manifesting in both self-harm and pathological behaviors. In August 1998, he attempted suicide by hanging while his mandatory appeal was pending. This act triggered a series of evidentiary hearings to determine his mental competency to proceed with his waiver of appeals. Medical evaluators concluded that while Arguelles suffered from dissociative and personality disorders, he did not sustain significant brain damage from the suicide attempt and possessed the capacity to appreciate his legal position. However, his behavior within the prison environment became increasingly bizarre. He began to practice pica, a disorder involving the ingestion of non-food items. Specifically, Arguelles was observed eating his own feces, paper, and plastic, necessitating multiple hospitalizations for intestinal blockages. This behavior is frequently interpreted in forensic psychology as a maladaptive response to extreme environmental stress or as a form of internalized violence used to exert control over a body that the state has slated for execution.
The final statement and clinical termination.
Arguelles' status as a death row volunteer placed him at the center of a national debate regarding the ethics of the firing squad. He chose his method of execution over lethal injection, a choice some analysts suggested was an attempt to maintain a degree of dignity or control over his final moments. The American Civil Liberties Union and other organizations argued that his execution would constitute cruel and unusual punishment, particularly given his waning mental state. The legal and ethical debates were ultimately rendered moot by Arguelles' own physiology. On November 15, 2003, at the age of 41, Roberto Arguelles was found unresponsive in his cell at the Utah State Prison. He was transported to the infirmary and initially revived, but he refused all further life-saving treatment. He died shortly thereafter from a bowel obstruction caused by his repeated ingestion of foreign objects. This self-inflicted medical catastrophe effectively terminated the state's case, preventing the execution he had spent years demanding.
Systemic and criminological implications.
The legacy of Roberto Arguelles' case is one of missed opportunities and institutional failure. The early diagnostic dismissal of Arguelles as unmotivated for treatment in 1979 is widely viewed as the catalyst for the 1992 homicides. This case highlights the inherent risk of using motivation as a prerequisite for forensic psychiatric care, particularly for individuals exhibiting high-risk paraphilic and antisocial traits. Furthermore, the legal fallout from his crimes led to significant litigation regarding the limits of governmental immunity. In Arguelles v. State, the Utah Supreme Court examined whether state officials could be held liable for the decision to release a high-risk offender. The court's determination that the decision to release Arguelles from the Youth Development Center was a discretionary function shielded the state from liability. But the case remains a landmark in discussions regarding victim rights and state accountability. The narrative of the Salt Lake City Strangler concludes with a paradox of justice. While the legal system eventually achieved a death sentence, it was Arguelles' own pathological self-destruction that dictated the time and manner of his death. His case continues to serve as a critical study for forensic professionals and legal scholars exploring the boundaries of mental health and the machinery of capital punishment in the United States.
I may have been sentenced to death, but in the end I went out on my own terms.
This concludes another episode of Homicide Cases as I close the file on Roberto Arguelles. Join me next episode where I'll be opening the file on John Armstrong.
Thank you for watching. If this is your kind of content, then give me a like and follow. It will help me keep this series going. Goodbye, and as always, stay safe.